shape. So he's got a pretty round cranium, a very skinny upper body, and then this huge squared off butt down the bottom end. And once you've got those basic shapes down, you can start to put in the rest of his details. Now, we had to draw these characters as people recognize them. They're already so well-known, iconic characters that, you know, we had to make sure our drawings worked. One thing that was helpful for me in this particular case was having Bernie Mattinson here. And he actually animated Rabbit in his, you know, in the original films. So I would always pass stuff by Bernie. And I was doing some model sheets of the character, and he said, well, those are pretty good, but you forgot his goatee. And I went, oh, you're right. He's got this little goatee right here under his lip. And I had forgotten to put it in. So having been, you know, artistically chastised by Bernie, I dutifully went ahead and put in his goatee. Now, the style that these characters are drawn in is what I would call Disney Angular 60s. Disney 60s Angular, if you will. Round about Sleeping Beauty time and then further into Dalmatians and Jungle Book, they settled on this kind of angular drawing style that was still based on anatomy. So for example, an elbow and a hand would be drawn like this, where you put a little fur on it, but essentially, you know, you're talking about quite broad straights ending in a point with a little fur on it. And then the forearm tapering down to another point where the wrist would break, and then you put the rest of his hands on top of that. Now, it's still based on the fact that there's an anatomy under there, despite there's bone here, bone here, bone here, which is why they could do those graphic shapes and get away with it, because it's still based on something being believable for the character. And you go ahead and add his legs down here. And this is what I would call your general sedate rabbit pose. He's not being overtly bossy. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of drawing Bugs Bunny ears for this character, which isn't right. They actually drew his ears based on rabbit anatomy. So the skin from behind folds over here, and then the skin from the other side comes around and folds and tucks under there. And this is not concave in here, and you have to bear that construction and three-dimensionality in mind as you're drawing. Otherwise, the character is not going to be particularly convincing. He'll just flatten out. And even though we're drawing these characters, we're conceiving them three-dimensionally. Now, one thing that was fun about Rabbit was that even though, you know, that's our general rabbit look, there were opportunities for him to break out of this, and to a certain extent, I'll credit John Lasseter with that. You know, as much as all of us love the original films, he said, listen, you guys have the license to make this, you know, your set of Pooh characters. You know, it's your generation's version of these characters. So we have to serve two masters. Certainly we have to make the characters recognizable and behave the same way that they would, but we push things for comedy and put more of ourselves into the characters, which we were encouraged to do. So, for example, when Rabbit was really, really cheesed off, I would give him an expression that was arrived at by one of our famous presidents. I am not a crook. And I have the opportunity to use that fairly often. it's still rabbit, but it still has that kind of expression to it. And also, he was a character who was great to show terrific frustration on. I think that's really when Rabbit's at his funniest. So, you know, aside from this or this, you know, we can also have him doing this. Where he is so completely overwhelmed and frustrated at what he perceives to be the not very bright people around him. It's great to draw these kind of angular arms and gnarled fingers. And, you know, and what I'm doing here is what I would call feeling first, anatomy second. Where, okay, that doesn't look like Rabbit, but now I can go back in and tie it down and put in all the nuances and details that make it Rabbit. You know, oh, okay, so I'm going to give a sneer to his upper lip here and another sneer on the other side. And I'm going to extend these lips down here. And I'm going to grit his teeth like this. And once you start tying it down, you can add the anatomy rather than starting with a very, very conservative construction of the character. And I think it's something that hand-drawn does particularly well. I could add an extra iris around his pupils, you know. You really make the poor guy frustrated as heck. And one of my source inspirations for that was John Cleese's performance as Basil Fawlty in Fawlty Towers, you know, which is really a great study in frustration and humor. I mean, he was just great. But you can't have Rabbit do that all the time. You have to build up to it in the same way that Basil Fawlty would build up to it over the course of a particular story. But it was nice to have that kind of range with him. And in the original films, they did do weird things where they would put a wild take on Rabbit or a disheveled expression on him, and they would break out of this themselves. So, you know, just for the purposes of humor, I think, you know, we pushed it a little bit further than it might have gone, but he still is Rabbit, you know. We're just taking it, that just a little edge further. This is what erasers are for. Mm-hmm. See, it's better to put his fingers facing that way, see. Makes a better drawing. Now, in contrast to this, I also animated the Backson. And one thing that struck me funny about the Backson character, given that we wanted to make it look like chalk drawings, was to draw him with almost no construction whatsoever, as if Owl, who can't draw, has drawn him. So basically, we would just do a circle here, you know, and then we would do the nose ring here and fill it in, and then we would do the teeth this way. And the cruder, the better, really. So it looked like somebody for whom drawing was not a daily occupation actually drew this character. And it was actually a lot of fun to draw him that way. There were certain things that we would do, like we would go for flat. So for example, when I was putting the lines on his horns, you know, I would make them straight rather than making them wrap around, because that's a little flatter, a little cruder, a little more graphic. You're still thinking of these characters as moving in three-dimensional space, but you're doing it with these graphic conceits, you know. We'd have these little curlicues to indicate his fur. You know, if we were drawing the Backson's arm, you know, I would do things like square off the fingers, You fill in the fingernails that way. If I'm drawing the stripes on his arms, I wouldn't make them physically wrap around. I'd actually make them kind of bizarrely flat. So again, it felt like a drawing that Owl might have made. It was actually very liberating to animate that way because you don't have to worry that the circle is perfect. We actually animated the Backson in ink on paper, and then the effects artists found ways to actually translate that into the chalk texture. I had done some experimenting with it in Photoshop and determined, well, if I animate this with a smooth ink line with a certain marker, then that can be translated, through these steps in Photoshop into a chalk texture, and they kind of adapted that, for the final look of the film. So, totally different from Constructed Rabbit. It's like one of these things is not like the other. But it's a kind of thing where that's one thing that's really fun about the hand-drawn medium. You can play with graphics. You can do different things that don't necessarily have to be literal, but are still fun to watch. Anybody got any questions?
The rabbit being based on a real rabbit, does he move differently than the other characters? Does he have a little more like stretch and squash or something? Because he's not plush.
You're right. He does, and so does Owl. They move more like anthropomorphic animals. Yes, there's a little more squash and stretch. If you look at Mark Hen's animation on Winnie the Pooh, for example, he animates his walk with very stiff legs because he is a stuffed bear, and so he has to show that through his drawings. With a character like Rabbit, yes, he's more of a real rabbit, so you can animate him more fluidly because you're not trying to convey that he is a stuffed toy. And all the characters fall somewhere within there. Tigger's a stuffed toy, but he's got an internal anatomy that allows him to bounce, and it feels like there's springs inside of him. And that's the way Andreas would animate him. So,
what about you draw like rabbits so quickly, and I was just wondering, does it become like a muscle memory because you must have to draw them so many times?
After a while it does, but when you're first getting started, you need some ramp-up time. You actually need to understand who the character is, how the character is constructed, what the character's role in the story is, and your understanding of the character comes as you're animating scene after scene after scene. A lot of animators like to say they don't know who the character is until the movie's over. But it's a kind of thing where the actual drawing of him, we'll start by having model sheets of the characters up on our pegs all the time. And after a while, you don't need the model sheets. It's in the gray matter. You know how to draw the character. And that's kind of when the fun turn takes place, because you're not concentrating just on how the character looks. Now you can concentrate on how the character performs. So hopefully that happens fairly quickly in the process for most people. Anyone else? Yeah.
How long have you been animating for Disney?
Oh my God. Back when I had hair, I was away from the studio for a time, but I started here in 1990, so you can do the math. And my first gig was the genie in Aladdin. So, so.
Are you influenced by, once they do the voice casting, does it change a lot of what the character maybe looks like at all?
Yes and no. It depends on the character. Okay, you're more intrigued by how the character sounds than how your voice actor looks. Okay. In the case of the genie, yes, I'm doing a little caricature there of Robin Williams' face. But he's constructed like a big, strong man with the bald head and the top knot and the whole deal. And in the case of Rabbit, he's already an established character. You don't want to change his design to look like Tom Kenny, nor would you want to, because he wears these thick glasses. looks like, you know, a guy and not an uptight rabbit. But you're going by the quality of the voice. You're going by, you know, you've all seen the film, right? One of the things that was fun is they decided to get Huell Hauser in to do the final scenes of the Backson, you know, and to animate to that was great because it was completely incongruous. Here comes this big hulking mass, and he finally comes at the camera and goes, wow, this is amazing. And you're contrasting that hulking mass with this great Huell Hauser voice that's coming out of him. And I think that's a lot of fun. I mean, it was fun doing Lewis in Princess and the Frog as, you know, because he had a lot of contrasts in him. He's a huge alligator, but he's scared of everything, you know, and he's in his element when he's playing jazz, but he's a nervous Nelly all the other times. So you're constantly playing that relaxed jazz state against that, go in the woods, are you kidding? You know, kind of behavior on him. And the more you can latch onto with the voice track, every now and again we shoot video of the voice actors as a reference if we want it. I tend not to use it personally because I tend to like to invent things that the characters can do that live actors can't do. And yet still be expressive. And I think that's the thing. I mean, Tom Kenny did a great job in making Rabbit sound frustrated, but I could go to graphic places that Tom Kenny can't. So it's the kind of thing where you're cueing off that vocal delivery. Most of the animation voices in classic Disney films, you know, in the Golden Age, were radio actors. You know, they were people like Verna Felton and Sterling Holloway and folks who had a career doing characters on radio. So it didn't matter what they looked like. It was just how that voice came out. And we tend to think the same way. A lot of times when we're auditioning for voice parts, the actors get very unnerved because we're not looking at them. We're just doing this and listening, and sometimes people who aren't used to it are like, what am I doing wrong? They're not looking at me. But it's so we can imagine without the visual what qualities that voice conveys. That was a rather long-winded answer, but